it.
Okay, let's begin with a word of prayer. Lord God, we thank you for the opportunity to be here to listen to the rendering of your word and to hear what it says to us. Help your word inspire us to be better in your service, not only today, but in the days to come. Amen. I have done a ton of work in the book of Genesis the last few days. First of all, wait a minute. Oh, here it is.
There we go.
Okay. The word Genesis is from the Greek, and it means origin. It doesn't mean anything like a caterpillar becoming a butterfly or anything. It just means origin. The original Hebrew name was this word right here, and if anybody wants to say it, go ahead. That's the actual word, which means in the beginning. Dave asks, was this originally written in the ancient Hebrew? The answer is yes. It was written in ancient Hebrew. Heaven knows how far back it goes. The stories were remembered orally for hundreds of years. And they were passed from expert to expert. Like I've said before, I wish you had seen the second part of Roots where James Earl Jones was playing Alex Haley, and he was in the village, and there was one member of the village whose job it was to remember the entire history of that, whatever they were, tribe or group or whatever, starting from the very beginning. And once he got started, you could not stop him and say back up. He'd have to start all over. And it took 2 days to get to the part of constant listening, to get to the part of what, Alex Haley was listening for. But that's how those were written. It's got 50 chapters. And I figured, it's 15 chapters a week. We can get this done. No. It's one of the longest in the Old Testament, believe it or not. Okay? So
is there a possibility that a lot of it was lost in translation?
could be. We'll be talking about that a little later because you just hit on to something. Tradition says that Moses recorded the oral stories as part of the law of Moses in the Pentateuch at about 1400 BC. How many of you saw the movie The Ten Commandments more than once? What's the last scene? He can't go into the promised land, so what does he give his wife? Here are these first 5 books. Make sure that they are protected. And here he hands them, not 5 scrolls, but 5 something else. And that supposedly the first 5 books of the Bible were written by Moses.
Yeah, but that was years and years later.
Exactly. I told you, this was all oral, so supposedly he was the one that wrote it all down. So basically, that was one school of thought. If you had a King James Bible, it would say right in the front, the first book of Moses, which we call Genesis. For years, that was believed to be the truth. Now they're not so sure. Recent scholarship points to a different picture. Now, the Pentateuch is the first 5 books of the Bible. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Anybody know what they all have in common? Other than Moses supposedly wrote them? That's where you find God's rules and God's law, in those first 5. So, now they're believing that there were these other sources. First of all, the Yahwist, known as J, that doesn't make sense, I guess the Yahwist Jehovah, I don't know, was produced in Judah, the southern kingdom, during the 9th century BC, which is earlier than this, or more closer to us. The Elonists, by the way, one of the original words for God was Elon, was produced in Israel, the northern kingdom, sometime around 8th century BC, The Deuteronomist, which is, we know this Deuteronomy, was known as D and produced in the 7th century BC due to King Josiah. At that same time, the northern kingdom was being attacked and being wiped out of existence. And then the priestly source, which is known as P, was written in the 5th century Babylon while the Jews were in exile. There's a lot of people who believe that all of these things were part of it. Now each one was recorded at a different time. It's not to say that Moses didn't record one of them.
Well, Moses had to get the information from someone, so.
Right, exactly.
The centuries, the later the number, the older, right?
Right, so in other words, 5th century is closer to us, that's 500 years before Christ, 7th century was 700 years. So that was 200 years earlier. Now, more recent scholarship declares that the Pentateuch came from these three, the J, the D, and the P, because they think the E is really just a paraphrase of that one. So, in other words, they're not 100% sure, okay, where it all came from. But this area here seems to have the most traction right now. If you read the scholarship, you would find that most believe that those books were actually put together from wherever they got them from while they were in exile, which would have been somewhere around the 5th century. Now, here's what's in it. This is why the book is so long. You have the creation, which is the 1:1 to chapter 2:25. Then there's the fall of man. The judgment of the flood, which is an interesting point. The judgment of the Tower of Babel was in there. Then you get into what they call the patriarchs. That's Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. They're in direct line with each other. So Genesis ends when Joseph is revealed to everybody as to who he is. Okay, remember, Abraham was called by God. Isaac is his son, Jacob is his son, and Joseph is his son. So all four of those are connected, and the stories around them are what happens between here and here. So you've got an entirely different mishmash of things put in one book. So the creation story, which clearly shows God created the world. Okay? And it was done in ordered stages. Remember, God is God. God could have just went, zap! Okay, everybody's here now, I can go home. Didn't do it that way. And this differs from just about every other account of where we came from. I mean, after all, where did Rome come from? You mean you didn't study this in high school? That Romulus and Remus?
Probably, I don't remember.
Yeah, Romulus and Remus, they were raised by wolves, and they founded Rome. You know, I mean, everybody has a story that's like that. No one has a story that says that there was a God somewhere that pulled all this together. Everybody else says the God, this became what it is, and the gods took it over and started manipulating it after it was here. This tells an entirely different story. Then it talks about the relationship with God and humankind with the rest of creation, which we can talk about. There is a clear definition in that first book between good and evil. That is the first place we see that there's a difference between good and evil. And that good is good and evil is bad. It also tells us that God works through people. Okay? God is not sitting up there like like you watch all those movies, with Pegasus and everything. There's a God up there and he's got like a chessboard and they're moving people around and doing all this stuff. God works through people, not the other way around. Diversity is favored by God. That's the Tower of Babel story. Okay? Diversity is favored by God. In fact, God said, I don't want everybody looking alike and sharing the same language. I want them all to be different. And finally, we talked then about the patriarchs, which is the beginning of God's chosen people. Okay, so that would be the founding fathers of the Jewish faith. And how many of you did see the Ten Commandments? Again, how many of you saw that? Did you see that? Remember the scene where he goes and meets up with the shepherd of Midian? Remember, he rescues the sheep that were being brought there by the woman. He meets the father, and he asks, so you worship Abraham? He says, well, that's a different way of worshiping Abraham that I'm used to. And he says, remember, Abraham is the father of many nations. Abraham is also the father of Islam, and he appears in the Quran. So we're going to have to get into that at some point. Now, what I had hoped to do, and for some reason we can't, we'll have to do it on the small one, is give you a short video I found that actually talks about what Genesis is all about, in his style, and he's able to put this whole thing together so much better than me. And that does bother me some, but so much better than me. So let's hope that this works the way I intended it. Okay, so we'll put him back on the table over there. I'll have to push the TV back a little bit. Yeah, there's plenty of room. Well, that's not going to work too good. So we'll have to put it over there. Thought this thing would move. What did you glue this to the table?
It might have glued it.
Anyway, now I got to put it somewhere where Dave can see it. We'll put it over there.
How about just right there in the corner?
What's that?
Can the two of us move that?
No, it's stuck to the.
They got it stuck in it.
Yeah, it's stuck to the table. So what we'll do is we'll put it right over here. You'll like the guy. He's got red hair. And I will make it full screen, and hopefully this sound will work just fine. And we'll be able to see this the way I had intended it. Next time I'm going to bring the older computer, because I have a feeling the older computer will work much better. He looks like, got such sad eyes. Alright, now, wait a minute. One last thing I have to do. Alright, there you go. Alright, now we'll do it. See, it says, one says the thing is on, the other says the thing is off. That always bothers me. Let's see what happens here.
Like Noah in the ark and Joseph with his many-colored coat. But what's Genesis all about? The book of Genesis is the first book of the Bible, and it's the second longest book of the Bible. There are a lot of interesting and well-loved stories in the book of Genesis, like Noah in the ark and Joseph with his many-colored coat. But what's Genesis all about? Well, we're going to look at the book of Genesis, at its story and also the structure of the book. And when we look at how Genesis is structured, we'll start to see what it's about and why it's so important to the rest of the Bible. But before we do that, let's take a quick look at how we got the book of Genesis and why it was written. Now, the story joined the law of Moses in the Torah. So the law of Moses began as a list of conditions that an ancient prophet gave to the Israelites about how they should interact with their God. And so the book of Genesis and the stories therein told about how the people of Israel even came to be. And so they began to be associated with Moses' laws. Over centuries, scribes worked on the books of Moses and the rest of the scriptures, maintaining them and pulling them together into a beautifully constructed Old Testament, which they called the Tanakh. Now, as to why Genesis was written, there are a few reasons, and it makes Genesis a very, very important book of the Bible in terms of understanding how the Bible works. Perhaps most important is that the book of Genesis sets the stage for divine and human affairs throughout the rest of the Bible. The Bible is very much about God's relationship to humans, whether it's God relating to humans through the nation of Israel, or God relating to humans through his son Jesus in the New Testament. But Genesis sets that stage and tells us a little bit about the default relationship between humans and God. It tells us a little bit more about humans too. This is where the Bible starts exploring humans' purpose and human nature. Humans begin in the book of Genesis with a really cool purpose, but throughout the book of Genesis we start seeing different elements of humanity that are not so good. It tells Israel's origin story. The nation of Israel had to come from somewhere. Every nation begins somewhere, and this is the collection of stories that the Israelites told each other about where they came from. And then finally, it does give a message of hope for non-Israelites. It's mostly for the Israelites in terms of who was reading it for a very, very long time before Christians came along. But it is relevant to the rest of the world in a couple of ways. Now, a really important thing to know about Genesis is its structure. The book of Genesis is 50 chapters long, but it neatly falls into two larger sections. The first section just looks at the relationship between God and all of humanity, and that's the first 11 chapters. Then, the last 39 chapters, so chapters 12 through 50, really zoom in on God's relationship with the nation of Israel, or rather, the nation of Israel's ancestors. And right in the middle, we see God making a set of promises to a gentleman named Abram, who goes on to be called Abraham. So if you understand the structure, part 1 has God and humanity, and part 2 is God and Israel, with a covenant set of promises in the middle. And then you're off to a really good start. Now, another cool thing about Genesis structure is that both of these sections fall into roughly 4 subsections. So in the first section, of God and humanity, we have a section on creation, a section on a curse, or when things start getting out of hand, a section on judgment and salvation, and then a section that talks about where the nations of the world came from. Likewise, in the latter part of Genesis, we have sections that are more focused on specific people. So we have a section on Abraham, a brief section on Isaac, a section on Jacob, whose name changes to Israel, and then a section on Jacob's sons, focusing on 2 in particular. Joseph, who's very famous, and Judah, who's not so famous, but vital to the rest of the Bible's story. So let's look at these sections in a little bit more detail, starting with section 1, God and humanity. So in the first part of this book, we see God creating everything right from the get-go. So in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And what this story tells us is that while there was chaos when the earth was formless and void, God brings in order out of that chaos. And not only does God create an orderly world, but he also brings in humans to help him run it. And humans are said to bear God's image, which means they represent God, and they're supposed to reflect the qualities of God, and they're supposed to be running the world almost as governors for God. And the humans get to live in this world with God. In fact, there's a lot of imagery to the ancient Israelites would have sounded like a temple. And so we end the creation segment with humans and God living together in this garden temple. In the ancient Near East, a temple was a place where the gods and the humans could coexist for a while. And so Genesis opens by saying there was a time when God and humans could be in the same place at the same time. They started in this garden temple, which is important to Hebrews through the rest of the Bible because the Hebrew temple in Jerusalem takes center stage for most of the rest of the Old Testament. Next, we have things getting out of hand with a curse, and there are two really big pieces of this section that are interwoven together. There's this sense of a supernatural or divine evil. A serpent comes into the garden and tricks the humans into rebelling against God. And then afterward, we get some very crazy, just out of this world sorts of stories about the sons of God having relationships with humans. There are these folks called Nephilim, which maybe the ancient Jews believed were part demon, part human. Maybe they believed that they were just regular humans that became so powerful that they were worshipped as gods. There's a lot of debate on that. But the important thing to know is that we get this sense of a supernatural evil that is corrupting the world. But also, humans are corrupting the world too. We've heard about Cain and Abel. Well, Cain kills his brother, but then later on we have humans becoming even more violent. And so from chapters 3 to 6, we see just things getting really, really bad in both the supernatural sense and in the human sense. And this is how the ancient Jews talked about that time. But there is a glimmer of hope in that God says that one day there will be a human who can defeat that serpent, which represents that divine evil that has come into the picture. So, good news right there at the beginning of the first book of the Bible. Next, we have the story of judgment and salvation. So, humanity gets so bad that God sends a flood, and it wipes out most of life in the world. However, one family that remained loyal to God is saved. And so we have these waters, these chaotic waters coming back over the world, but God rescues a handful of people from that fate. And it says that he really values human life. He wants human life to continue to grow and flourish. And so then that takes us into the next section, where we have all the people multiplying, and we get many, many people on the earth who decide to build their own structure. They want to build a tower that reaches into heaven, and you've probably heard this story, the Tower of Babel. And so at the end of the first section, we have this strange progression where once humans lived with God in a temple, a garden temple, and everything was fine. And by the end, we have humans trying to build a name for themselves. God doesn't like that, so God says, okay, I'm going to distribute all of humanity into various nations. And so each people group gets a language, each people group gets a land, and then later on in the Torah we find that the ancient Israelites believed that God also distributed the nations to different gods, and that's where these nations may have gotten their pantheons. That's the outlook that Moses has in Deuteronomy, at least. And so God distributes them all. So we have this spot where humans are rebelling against God. We have God divvying up the humans, and the humans going all to their own gods. But then God chooses one family to have a relationship with. And that family starts with a man named Abraham. God is going to bless all the nations of the world through Abraham's descendants. Pretty cool. This set of promises, this blessing, is passed from Abraham to his son Isaac, to Isaac's son Jacob, and on to the nation of Israel. Now let's look a little bit at the second part of Genesis. So part 2 of Genesis, we have Abraham. This is chapters 12 through 24. Abraham is called by God. He wanders around for his whole life. He never really settles down. He sojourns across the land that he was promised and through other lands as well. He is tested by God, but he passes the test because he believes in God. And later on in the Bible, Abraham is called Abraham the believer. Abraham's life is pretty interesting when you compare it to the rest of the Old Testament, because the life of Abraham kind of has some parallels to the nation of Israel before they got to the land. Remember, Israel was called by God out of Egypt. Israel wandered around in the wilderness for 40 years before they got to the land. So, very interesting parallel. Next, we have Isaac, who lives his life in the promised land, and he's blessed very much. He has a great deal of wealth, and he has 2 sons. This is kind of like Israel's history later on in the Old Testament as well. Israel inhabits their territory. They get to the promised land later on in the book of Joshua, and they stay there for a good long while. And not one, but 2 kingdoms come out of the people of Israel. So again, kind of an interesting parallel that foreshadows what's going to happen in the rest of the Old Testament. Jacob is a deceptive little guy. He tricks his brother out of his brother's inheritance, and because of that, he needs to run away. He's exiled back east, and that's where he starts his own family. But he eventually returns back to the land that God promised his ancestors and lives there. Again, this is a lot like what we're going to see in the rest of the Old Testament. Israel as a nation is going to be exiled. They'll be taken into captivity, off to Babylon, but they will be able to return back from Babylon after 70 years. So again, we have some foreshadowing of the rest of the Old Testament happening here in the book of Genesis. And then lastly, we have chapters 37 to 50 focusing on the sons of Jacob. So Jacob had 12 sons. Those 12 sons roughly map to 12 tribes of Israel. And 2 sons in particular are very important. One is Joseph. He's the one with the famous jacket that his father gave him. Joseph was the youngest of his brothers for a while, and he had these dreams of greatness. He was his father's favorite son, and his brothers were jealous of him. So, they sell Joseph into slavery. And after that, Joseph is tested. His integrity is tested. His loyalty to God is tested. His wisdom is tested. But he passes those tests and then emerges as this ruler and savior who saves many, many people from a famine through his trust in God, his wisdom, and his perception. So we have this story of someone who was of low esteem in his family, who was betrayed, tested, passes the tests, and becomes this ruler-savior. Foreshadows another part of the Bible, right? The New Testament. Judah has some very interesting storylines here as well. So Judah is another one of the sons of Jacob. Judah is the one who has the idea to sell Joseph into slavery. Not a great guy. And then he goes on to make some other really, really weird and bad decisions. But eventually he humbles himself and he offers up his own life on behalf of a later younger brother and offers to die in his younger brother's stead. And so we have a bit of a story of redemption for Judah, and at the end of the book we have this blessing given to Judah saying that from Judah will come a king who will rule over the nations in peace and justice, and it'll be a really good time. And that's a really cool promise to end on for Judah. So we have these things that are anticipating that messianic king, which Christians believe is Jesus. So both Joseph and Judah give us a taste of what's to come beyond the Old Testament. It's really cool. And we Thanks so much.
So what do you think of him, huh?
Like, he's pretty good.
Like I said, I really liked the fact that he looks good in red hair. But he actually speaks quickly, but he speaks in a way you can understand what he's saying.
Good job.
But now you see why the book of Genesis is so long. You've got all those different storylines kind of mushed together. Which, as you know, Dave keeps pointing out, they might have been this storyline and that storyline and that storyline, and somebody said, well, I'll put them all together. And why would they do that? Well, there's a good reason. When you want to buy, let's say if you wanted to buy paper, for instance, you'd go to someplace like Office Max or Staples or something like that, and it comes in a pack, and it costs what, $9, $10 for a whole ream of it. In those days, there was no paper, or very limited supply. But I guess the Egyptians had papyrus. Sometimes they would write on the back of sheepskins. They would write whatever whatever they could think of, and as a result, writing was a very, you only wanted to do it once, and you wanted to put as much into it as you possibly could. And that's why, if you look at one of the old codexes that they were able to find, that the biblical texts come from, there is no punctuation, there's no capital letters.
They just ran,
It's just characters going from one end of the thing to the other. So whoever translates it has to figure out where the sentence begins, where the sentence ends, and so on. They didn't waste an inch of that paper, of that whatever was written on. The scrolls that went out into the synagogues when they were formed. Remember, there was one person whose job it was to protect those scrolls because it's the only one they had. So that's probably part of it. Another part of it was you probably had one author trying to compile the works of several people and make it all make sense.
Okay, can we back up to Abraham is the first storyteller, is that right?
Abraham is the first, yes, that's Abraham was Jane Anderson's favorite biblical person, because Abraham was just told to go somewhere. Where? I don't know yet, just go. And when you get there, I'll let you know. And apparently he was very well-to-do when he left, he was living in somewhere near what was later to become Babylon, and went in and became a nomad. So he's the first one that there is a long story about. His life, his wife, his sons, the things that happened to him.
But he's telling the story of the beginning.
Right. And
where did he get his information from?
that is a very, very important point. Like I said, a lot of this stuff was oral. And it is believed that he, when he was living, in good times, he had heard the story through other Israelites that happened to be there. That's what's believed, because he said he heard the story and believed God, which means somebody had to tell him. The question is who? We don't know. Again, this was almost written in a what you might call today poetry. Okay, it was a story that was assimilated and made to flow. Okay, now Abraham, as I said, God spoke to him. Also, others had to speak to him first, because otherwise he wouldn't have listened at all. And so he apparently taught his son, who taught his son, and so on.
I wonder if, Dave meant, it's like, wouldn't Adam and Eve be the first storytellers, and they would, from them and their children, the story would progress and eventually got to Abraham.
Yeah, except there's that one little road bump in the way, the flood. Remember, the flood wiped out everybody. So anybody that was from Adam and Eve, except for Noah's family, according to the Bible, were gone.
But Noah wasn't in the evolution.
Well, he was, but what I'm saying is he was the only one who knew anything. You know, the scriptures say he was the only one that knew anything. Everybody else was gone. Which is why they start with Abraham, because, you know, they figured, well, since that whole section is now not part of this, we're going to start with this man and start it from there.
Abraham related to Noah?
I'll have to look that one up for sure, is to see if anybody's really proved that. But their logic is, since Abraham was alive, Noah had to be his progenitor. Okay, that's there's a lot of assumptions that are made here when these books were put together. For example, when you were in grade school, how many of you learned that Columbus discovered America?
No.
Yes.
He never set foot in America. He was in the Caribbean.
But that's why a lot of people don't believe in the Bible,
Yeah.
because it's stories. I hear stuff all the time that they don't believe in it because it's story. It wasn't, you know, like, you know what I'm saying? And stories change. Like I can tell Leona a story and she'll tell it to Linda and she'll tell it to Brian, and it changes within,
Exactly.
you know, so that's what I'm saying. That's why a lot of people don't believe that's.
Right. And that's true, but what I'm also telling you is, when you look at Genesis, you're looking at the age-old question: why was this story included when they wrote this whole thing down? There's an ulterior motive for everything that's in there. Like he just went through. He said that, you know, this is the, you know, notice he said this is a progenitor to this, and this is a progenitor to that. And he also said that what is important here is the relationship between God and man, not the story behind it.
That's the actual story.
Yeah, like for example, we'll be talking about creation next week, but I did a lot of research on this when I was in college. The fact of the matter is, it's not how God did it. That's none of our business. The story is God did it. Okay? I mean, it's like anything else. I could walk up to Dave and say, I want you to go home and make me a sandwich. And I'm going to leave now, and I expect in an hour there's going to be a sandwich sitting here. Do you know how to make a sandwich?
Sure.
What kind? See, that's all we know. God created the world. You know, how he did it, we don't know.
But somebody's claiming this is how he did it.
Right, he did it in stages. That's what they're claiming. Because notice, nowhere does it say that God did this or did that. The only specific is when he talks about how Adam and Eve were created. That's the only thing. Everyone else, he says he created the birds. Well, how did he create the birds? Did he go Zappo, or did he use evolution, or what did he do? You know, the whole, as we'll talk about next week, the whole concept of days is to prove that these things happened in stages. They didn't happen all at once. And so when the writer writes this, he's got to come up with, or she's got to come up with, a way of saying, how do I indicate stages to people who don't understand anything? I'll call them days, that they understand. You see what I'm saying? I'll call them days. They know what a day is. And that's,
So it really isn't days.
well, it's, you know, like it also says somewhere in the scriptures, I have to look up where, that God's day is like 1,000 years.
Not like our days.
Not like our days. So it could have taken
Interesting.
many millennia for God
Yeah.
to do this.
Really interesting.
Also, the seventh day, we'll talk about this. Why is that in there? Think about this. Why was the seventh day that God rested? Does God need to rest? No. But it's there for a reason. So keep in mind that what this gentleman said at the beginning, this book is the foundation for everything else that the Bible has behind it. So basically what they're doing is they're putting this together, and this is the starting point. You have to have a starting point. So they're saying that this is the starting point, and all the things that happen in Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy and First Kings and everything else is based on the notion that Genesis is absolutely accurate. Okay? So the writers believed it, and it shows in how they interpret what they write. And we'll get into that a little bit. But the most important thing is we cannot do 50 chapters between now and June, so we'll have to split it into the sections that he talks about. Also, there are some fantastic videos out there that are aimed at kids. They are fabulous when it talks about creation. It's actually a child going through the steps of creation, and he's got little graphics and everything. It's really, some of that stuff is really, really cool. It's all over YouTube if you want to look it up. This is one of the most popular topics on YouTube when it comes to biblical stuff, is Genesis. And there's like 50 different versions of things you can look at. I picked that one because it was 15 minutes. There's another one that's 28 minutes that's pretty good. But I figured, I learned in my class I just took that the average human being can only stand one talker for 15 minutes. Then they start to do this and this and this. By the way, just for fun, did you notice that there are people writing up about the jurors in the Trump trial? How many of them were looking at the ceiling, and how many of them were looking at the floor, and how many of them are falling asleep? And